Greetings all and welcome to Lucas Brews. In this video we'll be starting work on a 1/72nd scale Bf-109 F-4 with R1 cannon pods from AZ Models. In this video I'll cover painting the cockpit as well as assembling the kit and preparing it for painting. So without further ado, let's get into this one. To begin with, I gave all of the parts a wash in some warm soapy water to clean them up, and once they'd dried I began cutting out the parts with my sprue cutters, starting with the cockpit floor, fuselage halves, instrument panel, front bulkhead, the various smaller cockpit details, and the exhausts. I planned to paint the radiator flaps and landing gear on the sprue, so I cut their section of framework out and continued cutting out the wings and the propeller components. Any seam lines, flash or sprue points were then carefully sanded away using various files or sanding sticks. Once cleaned up, I then glued the seat tub to the cockpit floor, followed by the rudder pedals, which was a little bit fiddly but added some nice detail. After some cleanup with a knife, the cannon cover was glued to the front bulkhead, and then I glued it along with the joystick to the cockpit floor. To make sure the cockpit parts fitted, I placed them in the fuselage halves while they were drying to help line them up. Satisfied with the fit, I then glued the instrument panel to the bulkhead and sat the cockpit parts aside. I glued the propeller to its base piece and then fitted the spinner and added a washer to lock the propeller in place. Interestingly, the propeller lock is not mentioned in the instructions, but I added it since I like to rotate my propellers for stop motions, although this was a very fragile assembly and actually ended up falling apart later on. The struts were then glued to the landing gear bay doors so they could be painted together, and I assembled the wings by gluing the lower wing to both of the upper wing halves. For this, I first applied my normal glue of choice, which is Revell Contactor Professional, out of a nozzle, followed by some Tamiya extra thin cement, which was applied along the seam lines using the applicator to reduce any of the gaps. The flap and trim wheels were then glued to the left side of the cockpit seat, but the fit for these parts was very tight. Once they were in place, I was now ready to do some interior painting, so I sprayed all of the sub-assemblies and parts I wanted to paint at this stage, including the landing gear bay and radiators, with some Vallejo acrylic gloss black primer to unify the surface and help the following layers of paint stick to the surface. I gave the primer around 12 hours to fully cure, and then painted the interior of the landing gear bay, the inner side of the landing gear doors, and the radiators with some Vallejo Model Air RLM2 Grey. For painting Vallejo Model Air colours, I find roughly a mid to high 20 psi and thinning them with around 1 part Vallejo acrylic flow improver and 1 part paint seem to work pretty well, though I still mess around and experiment with them and do find that some paints vary. I considered using RLM02 for the interior of the cockpit as well, but decided instead to go with RLM66 Dark Grey, as this became the new standard cockpit colour when the F models came into production, though I wouldn't be surprised if some of them were still painted in this earlier cockpit colour. Once the RLM66 had dried, I began picking out the cockpit's various moulded details, starting with some Vallejo model colour flat yellow for the fuel lines, some of the engine controls on the floor, and the throttles. Model colour flat black was then used for the base of the throttle, along with the handle of the joystick, and as a base colour for the fuse boxes on the right side of the fuselage. Initially I used Vallejo model colour medium blue for the oxygen's wiring and system, but this colour seemed too dark, so I would later change this. Model colour vermilion red was also used to pick out some various engine controls, as well as to paint the flap and trim wheels based on the instructions. I repainted the oxygen system with a much lighter sky blue, which I was happy with, and then painted the base of the control column and straps for the cannon cover with model colour saddle brown. If I made any mistakes while painting these finer details, I would touch up with a tiny bit of the RLM66. To lighten up the cover on the base of the control column, I then dry brushed it with some model colour light brown to give it a worn leather effect. Decals are included for the instrument dials, so with the painting done, I cut them out, stuck them in some water for a few seconds, and once they started to come loose of the paper, I dabbed some water onto the panel and then slid the decals into place. I then dabbed some Tamiya decal adhesive onto them and used a cocktail stick to help push the dials into the recessed details. The armoured headrest cushion was then painted with saddle brown in a few coats, and then I used a fine brush and some Model Air aluminium to dry brush some metal scratches and chipping on the sidewalls, heavily onto the seat, and around the rudder pedals, and lightly in the landing gear bay and on the radiator doors. Just like with the joystick, I dry brushed some light brown onto the headrest cushion and did another coat on the joystick's base. After the chipping had dried, I then applied some Tamiya black panel accent over the entire of the cockpit and interior parts. This enamel panel wash flows into all of the recessed details, making them pop and giving a subtle grimy appearance. It also darkens the model a fair bit, so once it had dried, I used a cotton bud dipped in some X20 enamel thinners to gently rub away the excess and help it flow more into just the recessed details. In some parts of the cockpit things are pretty tight, so I ended up using a small synthetic brush dipped in the thinners instead to help move it around. Since the panel wash is enamel and the model colour paints are acrylic, this doesn't damage the paint underneath, which is really handy. After the wash and thinners had fully dried, I then removed a small bit of flash from the tail with a file, and then proceeded to glue the cockpit assembly to the right fuselage half. The fit of these parts was pretty good, so I then added the exhausts, which have to be added at this stage. A tiny bit of sprue had to be removed with a knife from them, but they went into place reasonably easy, though the shroud on one side did break off, so I had to glue it back into place. After taking a photo of the cockpit before it disappeared, I held the prop in place and ran a bead of Revell Contactor Professional along the right fuselage and joined the left side together. This kit has no guide pins, so it can be quite tricky to line the parts up, and some gaps were present. I used a bulldog clip and some masking tape to hold the fuselage halves together while they dried, and ran some Tamiya extra thin along the seam lines to once again strengthen the bond and melt the seam line down a bit, as I had done with the wings. Speaking of which, I glued the radiator flaps to the underside of the wing, and while the fuselage parts bonded together, I cut out the horizontal stabilizers, top part of the engine cowling, the two halves for the supercharger intake, and the barrel and gun pods for the 20mm cannons which were mounted under the wings. These parts were then cleaned up of any seam lines or excess sprue, and then I assembled the underwing 20mm cannon pods. Unfortunately, you can't leave the barrels off until after they'd been added, and one of my barrels did snap off and go missing, but fortunately I've done another AZ-109, so I had some spares. After a few hours, I removed the front tape and glued the engine cowling into place, followed by the supercharger intake, and fortunately both parts went on without any issues. The wings were then glued to the underside of the fuselage, and once in place, the seams were ran over again with the Tamiya extra thin, and I did the exact same technique while attaching the horizontal stabilizers. The front oil radiator was glued to the underside of the aircraft, along with the two 20mm cannon pods, and with that I'd assembled the aircraft as much as I'd planned to before painting it. There were still quite a few gaps however, so I began filling them in with some Vallejo water-based putty with a cocktail stick, and once in place I used a damp finger to wipe off the excess. I let the putty dry and then sanded all the seam lines down and rescored any lost panel lines, although it's worth noting that the 109 does actually have a seam line on the top of the rear fuselage, so you can leave a subtle gap in this area. I really should have done a more thorough job however in some spots, especially on the underside and front of the cowling, so I am making it a goal to spend more time on my models filling and sanding in future builds. To prepare the aircraft for painting, I masked off the landing gear bay and cockpit with some blue tack so I wouldn't paint over my hard work, and once this was in place, I primed the model with some Vallejo gloss black primer. This was mixed to a ratio of 2 drops of Vallejo acrylic flow improver, 3 drops of acrylic thinners, and 4 drops of primer. I sprayed the primer on gradually in short passes, building up slowly in layers until the upper surface was a solid gloss black. I then let the model dry for a few hours before turning it over and applying the gloss black primer on the underside in the same fashion. This was then left for 12 hours to cure before moving on to painting, which is what we'll be covering in part 2. Thank you very much for making it to the end of this video. I do hope you enjoyed it and got something out of it. If you did, please be sure to leave a like and also subscribe to the channel, as it really helps out. And if you have any suggestions on how I can improve my model making or any experiences you've had with this or other 1/9 kits in the scale, then be sure to leave it down in the comments below. A massive shout out to my wonderful patrons for helping me to fund not only buying these kits, but also the products I use to make them, and also giving me a little bit of money back for the time I spend making these videos. If you want to help fund the channel, then be sure to check out my Patreon. I'll leave a link to it in the description. I hope you've all had a wonderful Christmas and a fantastic New Year, and I'm looking forward to sharing part 2 sometime next week, and of course many other builds and stop motions in this new year. Thanks again for watching, and until the next video, as always, take care and model on.